as we got closer.
And these photographs were taken prior to any processing being done with Nicole's body?
Yes, I believe this was on our initial approach when we entered the field. I took the overall photographs first, and then as we got closer, continued to take photographs as we approached.
Then upon the approach with the medical examiner's office, can you describe what your role was at that point?
So especially as we approached the edge of the field and went down the embankment, we were looking for any possible evidence, any obvious drag marks, any signs of blood or clothing, being that she was naked. Continued to take photographs, and at that point, the medical examiner's office pronounces death, as that's their position to do in any death situation where that's part of their job.
In order to pronounce death, do you recall what the medical examiner's office did?
I don't exactly recall. They likely checked for any signs of life at that point and then made an official determination.
Were you involved in that determination at all?
No.
Can you describe what specific observations you made of Nicole's body as you got closer to her?
So as the picture shows, her head was to the south facing the plowed field. The feet were to the north towards Hoffman Road, laying in a prone position. Her arms were up in front of her, left over right. Her body overall canted slightly to her right side, exposing the left side of her face, which had obvious trauma, a large amount of blood, as well as the other scratches and abrasions on her back were obvious at that time.
And you indicated that she was largely naked. Did you locate any clothing on her body at that time?
As we approached further and I continued documenting, there were socks on both feet, ankle height socks, as well as a pink wristband on her left arm.
Did you have an opportunity to more closely observe that wristband?
Later on I did.
What was it?
It appeared to be the style of wristband that you would get if you paid admission to be somewhere, or maybe at a bar if you had your ID checked and they gave you a wristband approving you to buy alcohol.
And Sergeant, you indicated that upon your approach to the body, not only were you looking for evidence on Nicole's body, but you were also looking at the surrounding area, the vegetation. What observations did you make of the vegetation surrounding Nicole's body?
There was no significant obvious disturbances that I could see as far as drag marks or footpaths or anything like that. I recall there was a couple indentations in the ground where it looked like the dirt had been pushed up a little bit. I couldn't tell exactly what that was from, just that the dirt was exposed under the grass slightly. So I photographed those areas as well.
Anything that would have been significant for tread patterns of shoes or footprints or anything like that?
No, not that I could find.
In terms of blood spatter or blood-related evidence in that area, what did you observe?
There wasn't a large amount of blood other than directly where the body was. There was blood spatter on her arms in front of her mouth, so our initial indications would have been that her arms would have had to have been out in front of her when that happened.
And, from the lack of blood spatter in that area, were you able to draw any conclusions about whether the initial assault would have taken place in that location?
At that time, we didn't know for sure if that would have been the case, but the lack of blood other than immediately on the body kind of indicated that it likely did not occur right there.
Did you do anything to attempt to identify the person whose body that you found?
We did. Initially, we had no identification for who this person was. We utilized what's called a fast ID machine. What that is located at the Brown County Jail. There's a fingerprint scanner, and there's also portable scanners that certain officers in the county have. What it does is scan fingerprints, and if you've been arrested in the past, you're assigned a state ID number, which is associated with your fingerprint. So when we do a fingerprint scan, it'll check online records and possibly give us an ID number. So we attempted that. Lieutenant Neil Brown from Ashwaubenon Public Safety had a portable scanner in his squad. He did bring that to us at that point. I attempted to use that. I was able to get scans of Nicole's index fingers. And when we brought that machine back to Lieutenant Brown's squad, it was able to connect to his in-car computer and run a check on those fingerprints, which did not yield any results.
So you did check fingerprints, but no records to support identification.
Correct.
When you were using the Fast ID, were you dressed in tie-back and wearing gloves?
Yes, I was.
And you indicated you took the index fingers. Did you test any other fingers, or is index the common?
Index would be most common, and I was able to position the scanner under her fingers as to not disturb anything else other than moving the finger slightly.
I just want to check, can everyone in the jury hear the witness? All right, all right.
After you did or attempted the Fast ID, what was your next step on scene that day?
We were still, excuse me, working to identify who this person was at that point. We waited till further representatives from the Brown County Medical Examiners arrived on scene. So if I recall, Examiner Barry Ehrman, I'm not sure the light you see in the background beyond the vehicles there, I'm not sure where that would have been coming from. The lights I set up were directed the other direction.
But those are still the lights that were used on that day, like the big structural lights that you can see?
I'm sorry. In Exhibit 16, I don't see any lights. Is that the one we're talking about still?
17.
17, I'm sorry. That was the stadium-style lighting that was set up on the road facing to the south into the field.
Okay. And these pictures represent the scene accurately when you were there?
I believe so.
Judge, I would move to admit Exhibits 15 through 17.
Subject to redirect, any objection to 15, 16, and 17 being received?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibits 15, 16, and 17 are received.
And Sergeant, when you were on scene and when you first approached the body, or at some point you approached the body, you testified that you saw 2 spots in the grass by the body?
Yes, there was spots where the vegetation was disturbed and there was some dirt exposed.
And one of those spots was about 5 to 6 feet from the victim, and the other spot was about 1 to 2 feet from the victim?
Yes, if I remember correctly.
And the marks appear to be from something digging into the ground enough to disturb the grass and expose the dirt?
Yes.
And then I just want to clarify the identification of the body. That took a few days, and it wasn't made official until May 23rd, correct?
That's correct.
Judge, I have no further questions at this point.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
All right, at this time, Sergeant Loppa, you may step down.
Thank you.
And can I see those
Yeah.
exhibits, please? 15 through 17. All right, your next witness, Attorney Lassie.
Mayor, can we just have a very quick break just to set up for the next witness?
Certainly.
Thank you.
You want to take a 10-minute break?
That would be fine, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take an earlier break today.
All rise.
Agnieszka Rogalska, spelled okay. It's the common spelling. A, G as in Gregory, N as in Nancy, I, E as in Ernest, S as in Sam, Z as in zebra, K as in Catherine, A as in apple. Last name Rogalska, R-O-G as in Gregory, A-L-S as in Sam, K as in Catherine, A as in apple. Thank you.
You may be seated.
Thank you.
Whenever you're ready, Attorney Kerrigan-Mears.
Thank you. Doctor, just make yourself comfortable and please adjust the microphone to where you think would work the best.
Can everyone hear me?
Everyone's nodding, that's great. So doctor, could you tell us briefly about your education?
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Science from the University of Wisconsin. I also have a degree in English literature. After that, I completed 4 years of medical school. And then after that, it was a 4-year residency training in pathology at the University of Illinois in Chicago. After that, a year of fellowship training in Hennepin County in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And for the record, I completed my medical school in Poland, I will spell it for the court reporter, Karol Marcinkowski University of Medical Sciences, and that's Karol, K-A-R-O-L. Marcinkowski is M as in Michael, A-R-C-I-N as in Nancy, S as in Sam, K as in Catherine, I.
Now, did you just indicate pathology?
Correct.
What is pathology?
Pathology is the study of natural disease or the causes of death. Hospital pathology studies specifically illnesses that result in disease. It's what most people know of from the hospitals when they have a biopsy taken, or if blood is taken, or any fluids are taken for examination. That's usually done through the auspices of the pathology department, whether it's under chemistry, blood banking, or more commonly surgical pathology. Pathology also includes performing hospital autopsies.
If I may approach you.
Go right ahead.
Sure.
Prior to today, doctor, do you have a curriculum vitae that you prepared and provided to the state?
I do.
I'm going to show you what's been marked, excuse me, that's exhibit number 18, is it at the bottom?
Correct. 18.
Thank you. And that's been provided to council already. Do you recognize, in fact, what that document is?
I do.
And what is it?
It's a copy of my curriculum vitae or resume of all my training, presentations, and just a short summation of some of the activities that I'm involved in that are pertinent to my field of study now.
Thank you. And it's how many pages?
It's 4 pages.
And I would ask that it be accepted in evidence at this time.
Subject to cross, any objection?
No, Judge, thank you.
18 is received.
Now, doctor, you've outlined your educational experiences. Can you give us an idea of your work experiences, your occupational experiences?
Yes, so after studying pathology in the hospital, which is again the study of natural disease, after that I did a 1-year fellowship in forensic pathology with the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So in those duties, that was the training. Now, forensic pathology takes it one step further. So now in forensic pathology, one learns to distinguish natural disease from injury and to learn how to identify the cause and the manner of death. So that's a 1-year training process, and after completing that, I began working at the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office as an associate medical examiner, where I worked for 5 years. After that time, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where I am currently the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner. I've been there for a little over 3 years now.
So about what year did you go to Madison?
That was in 2014, the end of 2014.
What's your present title?
I'm currently the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner.
Do you serve other counties besides Dane County?
Yes, we have direct jurisdictional oversight over Rock County, Brown, Door, and Oconto counties as well, in addition to Dane. There are other counties that bring their autopsies to us, but we do not have oversight, so they have their own coroner or medical examiner who determines the wording for the death certificate and ultimately decides the cause or manner of death. But because the state requires a forensic pathologist or a pathologist to perform an autopsy, those jurisdictions can't do their own autopsies. So they will bring cases down to our office in Dane County, we'll perform the autopsy, potentially give a suggested ruling, and then basically they can go their own way from there. So those are, and I don't know all of the counties, but there, I would say maybe 8 other counties in the state that come to Dane County.
So the counties that you work for do include Brown County, is that correct?
Correct.
And you have worked other cases for Brown County as the role that you established as a medical examiner's office.
I have.
In addition to your work experience, can you briefly give us some ideas of appointments or committees or memberships in the professional area?
Yes. Well, things are kind of tight in forensic pathology right now. We don't have enough forensic pathologists in the state, so extracurricular activities are limited, but I'm currently involved with the American Society program, which is a post-residency in-service exam. So during training, residents will have to take examinations every year, kind of standardized training to other residents, and gives them an idea of what fields they need to study a little bit more in depth before they graduate. Who have already graduated residency can use again just to keep informed of the latest updates. So I'm a committee member there. I'm the chair of the anatomy. It's 3 people, so somebody had to be chair. Association of Medical Examiners position paper committee that was by appointment. It's essentially just a membership to review and position papers are being created by a national agency, the National Association of Medical Examiners, which serves as a standard for our group. What else? I'm a clinical adjunct professor at the pediatrics department. And for a moment in time, for about a year, I was by the American, which was trying to establish guidelines for recognition, identification, classification, and the nomenclature or naming of pattern injuries were too time consuming, and so I had to step off as the chair of that committee last year.
With respect to board certifications, do you hold any?
I do.
Could you name those, please?
Yes, so after completing residency, one is expected to take a board exam, which is a standardized national exam, to say that you meet the minimum criteria for diagnosis in anatomic and surgical pathology. So it's in anatomic pathology. After that, I'm also board certified in forensic pathology. And of course, during and after medical school, there are multiple different boards you have to take after your second year, your fourth year, and after first year of residency. And I hold certifications in all of that.
And you've obviously indicated you went to medical school. You have a medical, the Carroll University of Medical Science.
Yep, Carol Marching Cow Ski.
I won't try to pronounce it. Thank you. Now, you've indicated quite a few publications. Have you published? And I don't need you to name them all, but have you been published?
I have.
Have you also done presentations from time to time?
Yes, both in the teaching venue and in courts, mainly in teaching venues and national conferences as well.
So you've indicated that you've been in Dane County for some time period and you're in the medical examiner's office. Can you give us some idea of duties in that office?
In general, a medical examiner, especially in a physician-led medical examiner office, is tasked with determining the cause and manner of death. That begins from the scene, either through the use of investigators. In some jurisdictions, if they're small, perhaps the doctors will go out as well, but it's usually an investigator who takes the initial call, either from law enforcement, from a hospital, hospice agency. Rarely a funeral home will report a death to us that wasn't otherwise reported. And that investigator or that medical examiner designee will determine the case circumstances. In our institution or in our office, the younger investigators will actually run that by the doctors. In some cases, the doctors review it in the morning. But ultimately, somebody makes a decision about whether the case falls within the jurisdiction of that particular county. They will also determine whether that death falls within the jurisdiction of a medical examiner. As you can imagine, many people die in hospitals or at home that don't need to have an autopsy. They don't necessarily need to be reviewed by the medical examiner. If there's good evidence of an explainable clinical disease, or if they are in the attendance of a physician, or the circumstances are not indicative of a non-natural cause of death, and those instances are clear and undeniable, then that case would probably be let go. In most cases, an autopsy will have to be performed to determine that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
I'm sorry, an autopsy will have to be performed to determine the cause or manner of death. I'm not sure where I should sit to.
There's also some background noise, which I think is part of the problem.
Our scope is to determine the cause and the manner. So our investigators pay attention to things that maybe the police don't necessarily look at. So we're looking, and on most call scenes are suspected natural deaths, or we have to make that determination. So we're looking at medications that somebody is taking. We're looking at physical signs on their body. Are they starting to have thickened skin on their legs, losing some of the hair of their legs, which could be an indicator of heart disease? Or do we find non-prescription medication on the scene? Or are we seeing illicit drug use? So the medical examiner has a separate role in the investigation of a death. We also perform the pronouncement. It's only a medical examiner designee, a doctor. Some RNs are able to make a pronouncement, but essentially the medical examiner has to come and say, yes, we've checked the vital signs and this person is in fact deceased. So we are always involved in the investigation of death. The doctor's not always so, but our designees usually are.
And you indicated in some situations, just a viewing of the outside of the body, the external observations can be sufficient to make those determinations. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then an autopsy in layman's terms is when you have to do a more internal examination?
Yes, an autopsy encompasses both the external examination as well as the internal examination. The external examination is essentially the same once they are in our office, in the sense that we examine the outside of the body for natural disease, general biometrics, hair color, eye color, height and weight. We'll document any injuries if they are present. We'll make diagrams. We'll take photographs. We'll also draw a toxicology specimen, which can be sent out for testing. And then the autopsy will include another component, which is the examination of the internal organs. And this is an invasive, but essentially a surgical procedure in which we will reflect the chest, the skin, examine the individual organs to determine if there's natural disease or if there are injuries. Nature of those injuries are, and what their significance is, again, to the cause of death.
And you indicated that very important goals in your job then are determining the cause of death. Is that
Correct.
Now, you've done autopsies. I think that's pretty apparent. How many autopsies have you performed?
I don't have the exact number. I know I've done over 1,000 because I was keeping track. I think that 50 is probably a safe number, but between 25 and 75 times I think would cover the full base.
You said you did it as a fellow. What is a fellow?
The fellowship training is, again, that training that I did in Hennepin County. After training in hospital pathology, that is when one does a fellowship to train in the non-natural causes of death, which is the forensic pathology fellowship. That's what I did from 2008 and 2009.
Thank you.
I have.
Have you testified in any civil cases or been involved in any civil cases?
Yes, I have had a few depositions in civil cases.
So aside from testifying, there have been other times you've prepared and been ready to go to court, but sometimes those cases resolve themselves.
Correct.
As part of your profession, with respect to your position in the medical examiner's office, in doing an autopsy on Nicole Vander Heiden,
I did.
did you generate a report with respect to your work in that case?
I did. This is a collection of the information from the case of regarding the death of Ms. Vander Heiden. It includes an investigative report. It includes my autopsy report. It also includes the results of toxicology testing. It includes my diagrams and various miscellaneous sheets from the who did transportation. Simile, who was a dentist that we asked for this particular case, and the state vital death reporting system. The state requires us for non-natural deaths to fill out a separate report identifying the types of injuries.
For testifying today, Doctor, did you organize some of the photographs that you took and some charts that would explain the work you did in this case?
I did.
Did you provide that to our office as well?
I did.
We reviewed that previously. Is that correct, Doctor?
Yes, we have.
I'm going to ask that that presentation be marked with the court's permission at this time and be allowed to present.
And that'll be number 20?
That would be my understanding, Your Honor.
All right. Any objection to 20 being received and shown on the big?
So we respond usually as a team.
So when you were on your way, what initial information did you have? What did you think you were responding to?
Initially, we were told that there was a woman that was identified in a field and that there were some injuries of the face and that she was unidentifiable, and there was no information known at that time.
So you mentioned clothing precautions. Did you take those precautions as you arrived at the scene or after you arrived?
Yes, when there is a suspected homicide, the investigators will approach with full Tyvek suit. I believe the investigators at that time had concerns, so even before I arrived, they arrived in a full Tyvek, they entered the scene in a full Tyvek suit, masks, gloves.
And I'm sorry, you said you were also wearing those type of items?
Now, when I got to the scene, but we put those on before entering the scene, just again to make sure that we keep everything we bring inside, we keep it to ourselves.
And Doctor, I believe before you, there's a clicker that's present. Do you see that?
I do.
I think it might need to be turned on. I think we were trying to save batteries and save the county money. As we begin then, you did start, at some point in time while you're on the scene, you took photographs at the scene as well. Is that correct?
My investigator did, partly under my own direction and partly as part of his normal duties as an investigator.
The photographs that you're to show, though, they're all photographs you're familiar with, and they clearly depict what you observed also at the scene. Is that correct?
Yes.
So if we could begin then, with respect to the first photograph, basically of the scene itself. That's okay. And aside from these observations, the photographs are being taken, the manipulations that you discussed, is there any swabbing that's done?
In this instance, yes, we did take swabs.
What does that mean? What's a swab?
Well, when I say swab, what I'm referring to is a DNA swab. Remember those blotches of blood that were seen on the feet and the legs? Those were not associated with any injury underneath. So I didn't have a really good explanation for how they got there, which means that they may have gotten there because somebody else was there. And so for that reason, we actually used sterile cotton swabs with sterile saline and just did a swabbing of those areas to collect, if there's any DNA, it could be collected in that way. It was placed in a box and it was given to ultimately the crime lab, I believe the sheriff's office.
And did you recall Sergeant Lopnow being with you at the scene?
Yes, I do.
And in fact, he also was with you at the time of the autopsy, is that correct?
Yes, he was, poor thing.
And you mentioned that you were wondering or looking into the possibility of the area of the legs and near the ankles where there were not injuries, but it might show someone being there. Are you referring to if someone touched or grabbed those areas, someone else?
That's a possibility for DNA to get there.
At some point in time, then, do you become involved, or does your team become involved in the transportation of Nicole?
Yes. When we are ready to transport our patient to the morgue, particularly in a case that is either suspicious or is an obvious homicide or a suspected homicide, we will then place the body into a white evidence sheet. We will place bags on the hands, and if the feet are exposed, also on the feet. That's to preserve evidence, both DNA evidence as well as trace evidence. The white sheet would catch any evidence off the body, so that's just like a giant almost bag. And then the body is placed inside of a clean body bag. That body bag is then sealed on scene. That seal is photographed, and then we take official custody of that body and transport them to the morgue. And then again, photograph the seal before we break it to document our chain of evidence.
The pink ribbon that's on the wrist, that was something that was there when you arrived as well, the pink?
Correct. The pink ribbon that is on her left wrist in the lower left-hand corner of the photograph, which is poorly visualized here, but my gloved hand happens to be on it. That appears to be the type of bracelet that you would see in a club or a concert, and that was on the body at the time.
So then Nicole was then transported to Madison, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, at the time of departure on May 21st, 2016, her identity was still not known, is that correct?
That's correct. I believe we had received a missing persons report, and we had tried to see if there were any characteristics that would match that report. I think there were some, but we couldn't be sure. The facial features were too obscured, and we didn't have any characteristic features. Remember, I talked about scars, marks, tattoos. She did have characteristic jewelry in her belly button, but it wasn't something that was enough to identify her. You know, belly button rings aren't really all that unique. There's a lot of them around, and it wouldn't be enough to identify her.
And you indicated that transportation took place. Do you have a slide indicating type of containers?
Well, this is in the bag being sealed in the body bag. Again, that's an investigator, and I think it might actually be me here in Tyvek showing the seal. You can see the seal number. You can see that it's locked. This is the time that it was sealed, and in the lower right-hand corner, you have the first photograph from the autopsy. Again, you see that same body bag. You see that same seal. The number is exactly the same, and the number is the same. So it just documents, again, that transportation as well as the chain of custody. I'll also point your direction at this time to this medical examiner tag. So this is a tag that we use. It's a unique identifying number. That's the case number that we have. And the way it's generally oriented is so that when you write the photograph or turn it so that that tag is legible, this indicates the top of this marker is the top of the patient. The bottom of this marker is the bottom of the patient. The right side of the photograph is the left side of the patient as if you're looking at them. And it's exactly the opposite. The left side of the photograph is actually the right side of the patient as you're looking them. This is also a scale. So for your needs, this is 2 inches or 5 centimeters if you prefer, so that at any time you can kind of do an eyeball measurement if you need to. And it's mainly, again, just to orient the photograph and the decedent, because many photographs don't have the full body, but this tells us how the photograph was taken.
Thank you. And you basically then were responsible for the transport and the arrival and overseeing her person through to the 22nd.
We are responsible for it. I did not do the transportation. We have a transport van that does that. That was called to the scene and transported with a driver from our office.
Okay. Do you recall approximately what time you got back to Madison?
No.
As to the case then, did you start up again the next day?
We did.
May 22nd now, 2016?
Yes.
So no further examinations, no autopsy was done, because it's, I take it, pretty late into the day when you'd arrived.
I think we started the autopsy late because everybody was there till very late. Certainly, I get to leave the scene, but law enforcement still has to stay there, and they have to send somebody to the autopsy. There's also a substantial drive time from Brown County to Madison. I believe we started the examination in the afternoon or late morning, and the number of injuries and the amount of documentation that went along with this precluded us from doing everything just in that one day. And so the sum total of examination lasted from the 22nd to the 24th.
And a representative from Brown County Sheriff's Department was there, is that correct? It was Sergeant Lopnow?
Correct.
Was he there throughout the whole thing?
Yes, I believe so. He was certainly there for the external examination, and he was there for the autopsy. Now, on the third day, that was me going back just to take additional photographs. Sometimes after an autopsy, when the blood has drained away from certain surfaces of the body, other injuries will become apparent. So it's customary on our homicides and sometimes on infant deaths to wait after the autopsy another 24-hour period, then go back and re-photograph. In this case, I also took samples of tissue of her skin for histologic examination, and so the body wasn't released actually until a few days later, but he was not present for that last part, and even I think as late as the 26th I was still taking some pictures and diagrams.
So on May 22nd, 2016, does this begin with an external examination?
Yes, it did.
And I take it you followed the normal protocol in opening the bag and so forth, and it was about 2:08 p.m. you started up?
Yes, the only thing that was different here is that generally we will place the decedent on their back for transportation. That's mainly to facilitate a potential viewing afterwards. We don't want the facial features to be crushed as somebody is being transported. That's not necessary in most cases. However, because Ms. Vanderheyden was found face down initially, and because we felt that there was still evidence on the back of the body, we transported her face down, and we left her face down for the initial portions of the examination. It wasn't until we were done with the external examination of the back that we then moved her onto her back and began the external examination of the front of the body.
And I don't mean to make you feel tied to the chronological order, Doctor. With respect to the photographs that kind of play out the whole work that was done with respect to your work, I think the next one deals with her head.
Yes.
So that would be after she was turned, I take it.
Yes, these photographs are, the photographs and the diagrams are used then in a sum total. There are some photographs that show injuries better than others, and there are some that limit what is going to be projected in court. So these are photographs that have been taken throughout the entire time of the external autopsy examination, and I don't think I used any from that third or fourth day, but certainly from various portions of the examination as a whole.
There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs in this case, is that correct?
Yeah, something close to about 500.
Well, with respect to the next one that you have, I'm to that one, and again, it's the head of Nicole, is that correct? Taken, if you could tell us the significance of what you viewed as you viewed it.
So this is a photograph of Ms. van der Heijden lying on the autopsy table. She is on her back at this point. What we're looking at is a photograph that includes part of her face, specifically her cheek, her forehead, and part of her neck. Again, I'll draw your attention to the medical examiner tag. You can see that it's sideways, but if I flip this photograph 90 degrees to the left, then it would be facing downward. So we can see that leftward of the tag is Miss van der Heijden's shoulder and eventually her body and arm, and rightward of this tag is the top of her head, her hair, and her body. We're looking at her ear, her cheek, parts of her chin and her neck and her forehead. The nose is not visible in this photograph.
Now, it's a very graphic photograph. There's a dark area. Is that a substance on her person, or what are we looking at that point in time?
So if I may advance the slide.
Please.
Okay. So what we're talking, or what Ms. Mayor's Kerrigan,
Close enough.
is it Kerrigan Mayor's?
Kerrigan Mayor's.
Kerrigan Mayor's,
Never
I'm sorry.
hyphenate your name. It's a bad idea.
Polish names can be problematic too, so I understand. So as Ms. Kerrigan Mayor's identified, we do see a dark area on her face. So what we're outlining here in the circle is a portion of her temple, her eye, and her cheek, and also her chin. And this is the blunt force injury that I talked about earlier, which is an abrasion. So here we have a force applied to the face with an object that doesn't have a sharp edge. So a flat object, or sometimes a rounded object, but something certainly that doesn't cut, essentially. But it can still injure the skin. And in this case, if it's strong enough to actually scrape the surface of the skin, it will leave this mark, which is an abrasion. With exposure to air, an abrasion will dry and it'll become darker. It can also bleed and form a bit of a scab. So again, something like falling off your bicycle and scraping your knee, or a rug burn, those are all examples of an abrasion. And as you know, those can kind of scab over and they get dried and they get darker. So what we're seeing here is nothing, the body has already been washed. This is an injury on her face and on her neck and on her chin.
Was another point on that?
Yes, if I may advance the slide. Whoops, too far. I don't know if I can go back. There we go. Excuse me. So the two smaller circles on the same photograph are now identifying the areas of her orbital ridge, which is the eyebrow on her left side, and also the lateral canthal fold of the eye, so it's essentially the corner of the eye. What you're seeing there are lacerations, and those are breaks in the skin or tears in the skin. These are also blunt force injuries. So these are injuries that are incurred by an object that doesn't cut, but it crushes. So if it's very light or superficial and it has the ability to take off skin, it's an abrasion. If it doesn't take off skin and it just crushes the tissue underneath, it's called a contusion, or what we normally know as a bruise. If it's more forceful than that, it can actually tear the skin open, and that's called a laceration. So the skin is just broken. If it's more forceful than that, it'll cause a fracture. So those are your four basic subcomponents of a blunt force injury. And on the lateral portion of her eye and also on the left side of her eyebrow, she has these areas of split skin, these two lacerations.
Thank you. Did you make further observations and other photos that deal with the neck area?
Yes, I did, which I accidentally advanced to.
Well, we've spoiled the surprise, but if you would, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you tell us what's depicted in this photograph?
This is a photograph of Miss van der Heyden on her stomach now on the autopsy table. Again, the body has already been cleaned, so we're looking at injuries that are present there that have no actual, there's nothing there other than injury in her actual body. So again, the medical examiner tag is pointing downward, so the top of the photograph would be the top of her head, the bottom of the photograph would be the bottom of Miss van der Heyden's back, and feet lower down. And we're actually seeing her now from a right profile, so her face is not flat down, it's actually turned a little bit to her right. What we are seeing in the top right-hand corner is a portion of her right ear underneath the marker, but what I'd like to draw your attention to, if I may advance the slide,
Please.
is, again, the same area of red, brown kind of abrasion on the back of her neck as well. If I may advance again, there's also something else that you might be seeing here, which is a little bit unusual, and it's not working apparently, is this upside down V-shaped area where there is no abrasion, and that is in the middle portion of the photograph and in the middle of this circle for the court reporter. That is consistent with an area where there either wasn't an injury or something was there. You may have also seen it on the previous photograph where there was a mark along her neck, and this is consistent with a ligature, where there's something that's tight around the neck that's impeding blood flow in that area, and it's also covering it. So there's no abrasion there, or there's no blood reacting to that area because it can't get there.
Doctor, you mentioned it was also shown in the previous photo. Can you go back to that? Or you want
Yes.
So what area are you referring to there?
In this photograph, I'm referring to the area on her neck that's depicted on the left hand, middle of the left hand of the photograph. And you can see this area of abrasion, which we'll describe a little bit later in detail, but also you see that there's, abrasion on the neck, but then there's also this area of sparing.
Thank you. For the record, it's sort of the darker stripe on the left side of the photograph that's on the neck.
Correct.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you if you want to go forward. Thank you. You then broke down and categorized this area with respect to the various injuries. Is that the diagram we're now looking at?
Yes, the report will document injuries in various sections: head and neck, torso, so chest and back, the arms, legs, and then we'll categorize it in each subsection as how many abrasions there are, how many contusions there are. We'll give those descriptions. The idea is to create a record of everything that I saw. Again, the photograph is the standard of documentation. We also use these diagrams, but essentially what gets admitted to court is this report. So the report should document all of these injuries that we find and give it, a shape, a color, a size, potentially a depth, and its characterization, whether it's an abrasion, contusion. Sometimes you can have groupings of things, and then sometimes it might be important to identify if the groupings have a shape or a specific location or a specific pattern. So the report documents all of those injuries throughout, from her head all the way to her toes, about what injuries I actually saw.
And the shading, was that done by you after making the observations that you did make?
Yes, so this is a photocopy of my original notes. I took out some of the writing because it was distracting, and then I highlighted in red those areas where injuries were present to distinguish it from the black and white of the normal diagram.
So with respect to just the head and neck of Nicole, there were 36 injuries documented by yourself during this procedure.
Yes, they're not all documented, they're not all shown on these diagrams, but in sum total there were, as listed in the presentation, about 20 different grouped abrasions, so meaning that they were together, so they might have subsets. 8 grouped contusions that had some subsets there for descriptive purposes, and 8 separate lacerations, or those breaks in the skin.
Thank you. What photograph did you next indicate had significance for us?
I did not, but I did make a list, as we discussed, about the internal injuries of the head.
Thank you.
So again, the next component of the examination is that of the internal surfaces, and that's not just limited to the organs of the chest. Your brain is an organ, the skin is an organ, and so all of these also have an internal side that has to be examined. And in doing so, on the head, what I found was that there's extensive bruising throughout the entire scalp. In addition, Ms. Vanderheyden also had what's known as an avulsion. So that's a tearing of the skin between the two layers of the skin, such that it creates a small pocket where the blood can accumulate. And so you can see here, and if it works, the arrow will show you the direction. The avulsion pocket tells you also which direction something was going. If you move your finger across the loose skin on the back of your hand, if you're old enough to have loose skin on the back of your hand, you'll see that it folds up, okay? And it creates a bit of a pocket. So where that pocket formed tells us that that was the direction that the injury was coming from. So here she had an avulsion pocket that was forming from front to back on the left side of her scalp. And again, these are just diagrams, these are recreations that I made of these injuries. We also found that she had lots of injuries on her tongue as well. If I were to show you cut sections of the tongue, you would see that the whole thing had hemorrhage. There was blood inside the whole tongue, but unique areas that were identified were bruises on both sides of the tongue and also lacerations. Now, these were consistent with bite marks because they were in those areas where you would expect somebody would bite down on their own tongue. We also found a fracture of the skull, and it may not be projecting well, but the photograph that's coming up, this is the inside of the skull as if you were looking top down. So the bottom of this photograph is actually the back of one's head, and the top of this photograph is one's forehead. Your eyes are behind these two ovals here at the top of the skull. What we're looking at is a fracture at the junction of two bones, or three bones actually, the sphenoid bone, the frontal bone, and the temporal bone. And this is what's known as a partial hinge fracture. So to break that requires a substantial amount of force. We see this in motor vehicle accidents, it'll go all the way across. Here it's not that extensive, but it is involving that area of the inside, the bottom of your skull, between those three bones. We also had a fracture of the mandible. Again, this is just a schematic of the right side of the face, of the skull, in the skeletal form after there's no soft tissue. And we can see that the mandible was actually fractured in two places, creating a wedge. And this was the right side of the mandible.
Would that take a significant amount of force, I take it?
Yeah. This is not something that one would see in a healthy individual without osteoporosis from a fall at standing height, for example. It would be rare.
Okay, thank you. And then, I'm sorry. I didn't
No, the rest of the injuries don't really show well either on diagrams or on photographs, so it's just a list. So in addition to the injuries on the scalp and of the bones, and also the soft tissue of the face, we had bleeding around the brain. Your brain has a covering over it called the dura mater, which it means essentially tough mother. That is the Latin meaning that it's just a really strong, kind of a seatbelt for your brain. Your brain can jostle around in your head, and it wants to prevent that. So it's just a membrane that tries to keep it in place. But the problem with that is that when the vessels between the brain and that dura mater are broken, that space will start to fill up with blood. And your brain doesn't have anywhere to go, and it essentially gets crushed. So a subdural hematoma, or a bleeding underneath the space, starts to slowly crush the brain. She had a little bit of this, not a lot, but she had a thin film of it. She also had hemorrhage in another layer, the pia mater, which is the soft mother, which is a subarachnoid hemorrhage, or the arachnoid membranes around the brain. So we see that she's alive at the time that she's incurring these injuries. She has a heartbeat because it's bleeding into this, and she's obviously going to be suffering some neurologic sequelae. And
with respect to the internal injuries of the head, then, doctor, is some of this areas that you've covered already with respect to specific injuries? There are another great grouping of injuries then with respect to this area as well.
These are just the internal injuries. They are separate from the external injuries that I identified earlier. So this is after, again, the skin is an organ and it has an internal surface. So we will actually examine the skin. In some cases, if there's an injury on the outside, we'll actually reflect the skin and take a look at it on the inside. There are also muscles of the cheek that you can't see just by looking at somebody, but there could be injuries there. So in this case, when we did reflect Miss Vanderheyden's skin on her face, we found additional bruises in these areas highlighted in red, and that included the glabella, which is this middle portion of your forehead, around her eye ridges, specifically the right and left eyebrows, around the nose, very extensive hemorrhage around the left cheek, around the lip, and in the right jaw where we saw that fracture.
Doctor, then did you move on to the area of her torso with respect to the examination?
I did,
With-
or at least in respect to the autopsy.
Thank you.
Oh, no, I did not, apparently.
While we're on that photograph, if I may, so you did make specific observations with respect to her neck, is that correct?
Correct?
Is your next picture going to move on to the head, to the torso area?
I would have to, I don't remember, I believe that there's some, then if we advance it, there would be some things identified on the neck, but I could certainly advance it forward
go
to
ahead,
talk
thank you.
about the torso. Okay, so this is the torso,
Thank you.
or the back anyway.
All right, so she's obviously in a downward position at this point in time.
Yes.
So what observations did you make while you were performing the examination at this point in time?
Again, Ms. Vanderheyden is on her stomach on the autopsy table. We're looking at a photograph of her back from her left profile. This is her left hand. This is her head at the left upper hand corner of the photograph. And we're seeing a bunch of these abrasions here on her back. Again, the abrasions are scrapes of the skin, and you can see a very kind of a haphazard, wispy pattern of these. Essentially, they have a top-down kind of a direction. They're going either from the top down or they're going from inside outside, but they are flowing, linear abrasions on the back.
Okay. Thank you. And on to the next photograph. We're again looking at what positioning of Nicole at this point.
So in this photograph, Ms. Vanderheyden is on her stomach again on the autopsy table, and we're looking at the back. The medical examiner tag along with this ruler are outlining the same injury that I circled that we saw from the bird's eye view on the scene. Remember I said that she had something on the back that had a pattern to it? This is a photograph of that area of contusion on the midline upper back, and you can see that there are linear parallel portions of it. There are areas of sparing as well, indicating a pattern.
And when we talked prior with respect to the positioning of the body at the scene and the blood spray that was noted, you indicated there were some observations that you later made with respect to her back or even at the scene. Is this photo indicative of perhaps where blunt force trauma was applied to cause that blood spray?
For sure there was a blunt force trauma applied here because it makes a contusion.
Okay, thank you. With respect to a summary then of the numerous abrasions and contusions, with respect to the torso, did you do a listing?
Yes.
And that's obviously before us now. There's roughly some 41 different injuries that you noted in addition to the hemorrhage?
Yes. A little bit more, I think. I'm not very good at math, but I think it's 43.
Thank you. With respect to distinctions between antemortem and perimortem injuries, were you able to diagram that for us and give us some information on those points?
I was, and I will advance this slide. Here we go.
Thank you. First of all, could you define those terms for me?
Yes. So antemortem means before death. So remember I said that I was able to tell that she was alive at the time she incurred the injuries of her head. That's because she still had bleeding into the inside of her head. We also had blood forming in that avulsion pocket, and there's hemorrhage underneath and contusion, which means that there's blood flow, which means that there's blood coming to that area in response to an injury. So those are antemortem injuries. However, unlike in the movies, it isn't just an instantaneous, like you snap your fingers and everything stops working. You still have blood inside of your vessels. And so when a body is injured, even after death, there might still be a small hemorrhage that's left there. Those are known as perimortem. if somebody is dying and they're going into shock, their body automatically starts to collect blood into the central organs, the brain, the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, those things that really need to survive. It could survive without a finger, and so if there's an injury in a distal portion of the body, it's not really responding the same way. So there are injuries that have very faint signs or very little hemorrhage or less hemorrhage than what we're seeing. And those are known as perimortem. So those are either happening as somebody is dying or they're happening very shortly after death when there may not be a heart rate, but there's still blood there. Eventually, your blood will pool to just one part of your body. Think of tea leaves in a cup of tea. Or grapes inside Jell-O. Eventually they'll fall to the bottom. That's called lividity. And therefore, another injury on top of an area that doesn't have a blood response is going to look very different long time after death or a few hours after death or at some point when there's no blood there anymore. Those are known as postmortem. But there is an area of time in which it might be difficult to distinguish antemortem injuries, so absolutely before death, and postmortem injuries, absolutely after death. And those are known as perimortem injuries.
And the color distinctions on these?
One of the ways that we can try to identify whether something happened when somebody was alive or if it happened after they had died was to not just use the naked eye. We can use the microscope to see if there's blood there. Because if we have a substantial amount of hemorrhage and it's actually between the fibers of the skin, then that tells us that this was an actual injury. But your body under the microscope has larger groupings or fascia. So if you just have blood between large groupings of muscle, for example, we know that that generally tends to be an artifact or it could be a perimortem or postmortem injury. So what I did is I took small sections of the injuries that I identified on Ms. Vanderheiden and I put them under the microscope and I compared what they looked like. So the letters represent specific tissue samples under cassettes, so they correspond to my slide. So that has no significance necessarily to you, but the color does. So those areas that are red, I saw definite hemorrhage under the microscope. Those areas that are green either had nonspecific hemorrhage or had absolutely no hemorrhage at all. Those are probably either perimortem or postmortem. But these injuries, certainly of the head, of the cheeks, on the chest, on the breast, on the bilateral arms, on the buttocks, on the back, on the neck, behind the ear, and on her hands, certainly on the right hand, those had hemorrhage underneath. Those were real injuries. They were before death, antemortem. And then also the right cheek, the left cheek, and I can't read that last one. The muscles of the neck also had hemorrhage as well.
So there was a variety of injuries to both before and after death.
Correct.
As to her genitalia, did you do an examination of that area and did you make any observations?
Yes, obviously that's part of the normal body exam, and so we would document that as well.
Do you have a diagram that shows any observations of injuries to those areas?
I do. Just for basic anatomy, this is a diagram of a woman if her legs were spread apart, and you're looking at top of the photograph would be the top of her body. This is what's known as the mons pubis. So this is that area above the pubic bone. Men and women have that. It's just the area of your body above the pubic bone. The bottom of the photograph has the anus, and then there's everything in between. So there's the vaginal vault, there's the opening of the urethra that leads to the bladder, also the clitoris. We also have the internal and external labia. The external labia are represented by these softer mounds on the center of the photograph, and a little bit closer in you have the inner labia.
So I appreciate that those aren't everyday terms. Do you also then have a diagram that shows where there were injuries noted?
I do. So there were lots of injuries on the mons pubis that are just not really, I'm not able to draw very well on the mons pubis here. They're on top and slightly on the inside of the mons pubis, just as it's starting to form the labia here. There are also many contusions inside of that area. There are contusions of the labial folds leading up to the clitoris, the urethral meatus, the internal labia, and there are also injuries inside of the vaginal vault. Now, again, there's an inside component to this as well. The internal vaginal vault or inside the vagina is not just the only internal surface. When you take that skin off, or when I did in this case, reflected the skin, there was substantial hemorrhage underneath all of this soft tissue extending into between the muscle, the skin, and going into the fat underneath there between the bone and the skin.
Now, were all these injuries of the same nature of blunt force trauma?
Yes, they could be. Let me just, I think there's one more, yeah. The other thing is that there was blood in the vaginal vault. That's the other finding.
With respect to the type of injuries, do any of these indicate penetration?
The injuries to the vagina that are inside have to have been incurred when something was inside the vagina. So some blunt object have to have been there. So that is definitive of penetration.
Which injuries could you show us with?
Yes, using the pointer, I will point to the inferior portion of the bottom wall of the vaginal cavity identified here by the two little red marks, but it corresponds to the arrow that's associated with the third, there we go, sorry, the third bullet point on the photograph.
So where that area is located on a person, that would cause to have to be penetration of some sort to affect that area.
Yeah, it's an internal surface, it's inside the vagina.
The other areas that you've mentioned, those could be injuries that were sustained from an external area?
Yes, those are all external surfaces.
So someone kicking or stomping on that area, would that be a possible cause?
It's consistent with that?
But the interior penetration that you've mentioned, that could be caused by forceful penetration of something or some object, is that correct?
Injuries inside the vaginal vault obviously means something had to have gotten into the vaginal vault, so it implies penetration.
Were you also responsible for the utilization of what's called a SANE kit?
Yes.
And when did you employ that particular kit?
The SANE kit, which is, let's see, I think it's sexual assault nurse examiner kit. It's a sexual assault kit, is a standard collection of swabs and samples that we do on many of our homicides. So it is, again, it involves taking swabs and saline and specifically swabbing areas of the external surfaces of the genitalia as well as the internal surfaces, including the vaginal vault, the cervix, the mons pubis or the outside. It'll include things like pubic hair, combings or clippings if present. We do fingernails separately, so we don't include that in the SANE kit. It includes an oral swab, a rectal swab, floss, dental floss.
And were those samples, were those obtained by you during this examination?
Where applicable, they were, yes.
Did you indicate a buckle of the victim herself, of the deceased herself, or, excuse me, is there also a blood drawn with respect to determinations for the deceased?
Yes, we do draw blood.
Okay. All these materials that are recovered from her person, are those turned over to the Sheriff's Department in this case?
No, we return the DNA swabs that were taken. We'll return the assay kit if one is taken. We will give them clothing and personal effects if taken. Any evidence that's recovered from the body. We'll also give them the handbags, the foot bags, the white evidence sheet. Sometimes they'll get a DNA standard card, not always, but sometimes they will ask for a separate DNA standard card. Otherwise, there's a bit of feedback, I apologize. Otherwise, we will keep samples of blood for DNA testing, and by that I mean if it's ever needed for identification purposes or testing for a disease, we can keep that. It's just a standard we take. We take it also for toxicologic testing. We'll take fluid from the eyeball as well as urine for that. So we will retain those things for our office.
And you followed those standard procedures in this case, is that
Yes.
correct? Now, I think one more item was missing off there. You said there was blood in the
Right.
vaginal vault as well. With respect to the injuries you noted that would have indicated forcible penetration, would those injuries denote that there was pain suffered as well?
Well, the genital areas are painful areas, as I think we all know. There are a lot of sensitive nerve endings at the end of the genitalia, Surely any blunt force trauma that causes a bruise, if anybody here has a younger brother or sister, you know any bruise is going to cause an injury, or any blunt trauma is going to cause an injury. And this might be, this is certainly an area where there's enough nerve endings that this would be painful.
Thank you. With respect to lower extremities, did you also do an examination of those areas? Oh, excuse
Oh,
me.
I
I'm
did,
sorry.
yeah. There was just one more thing.
you.
We don't think of we kind of lump the breast sometimes in the torso, but those are genitals as well. Certainly there's a different association of breasts than there are with, for example, the back. And therefore, in the description of the genitalia, I've also included that there were various abrasions to the left breast.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
That's my fault.
Then again, I think moving on to the lower torso, please.
Yeah, the lower extremities.
Sorry, extremities.
So here we are looking at Ms. van der Heiden's foot. We can see that she has these pink areas, pink-purple areas that are highlighted by yellow circles. Those are bruises on the tops of her toes, on her great toe, just below her second toe, on the fourth and fifth toes, and also on the back of the left toe. If I may advance the slide.
Please.
You can also see that on the right foot, you can see on the bottom of her right foot there are bruises as well. And also on the edge of the left foot, there is a bruise as well.
Thank you. The next slide.
This is a photograph of Ms. van der Heiden's right foot. You can see again identified with the red circle as an abrasion. And then with the next red circle is a contusion on the lateral, so the side of the left foot at the pinky toe, the smallest toe. Again, next big circle in the middle of the photograph is another bruise. There's another bruise, more bruises on the ankles and on the side of the ankle as well. And on what's known the distal or the further left, the distal right leg, there are again additional bruises there just before the ankle.
Thank you. And on to the next slide.
This is the inside of the left foot, and again, this photograph doesn't give you a good orientation, so again, the medical examiner's tag is pointing downwards, so the right side is the bottom of Ms. van der Heiden's foot, the top is the ankle or the calf, and here we're seeing a contusion that also has an abrasion in the middle, which I did not identify by any circles, but I'm pointing to the center, right at what's known as the medial malleolus, which is the bone right on your ankle. There's an abrasion there. And around it, from the approximate, I would say 7 or 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock positions, you can see a red-purple bruising around there.
Is there specific significance as to these injuries in these locations?
The significance is significant or dependent on the circumstances. So these are injuries in areas of the body that are usually protected. The bottom of the feet are generally not something that you're going to have a lot of bruises on. If you're someone who fell down the stairs, you might have a different explanation for these, for example. This is somebody who has suffered a head injury, has suffered a strangulation injury, which I think we'll talk about later. And so these are consistent with injuries that if you were kicking somebody, for example, or somebody was grabbing you in those areas, you can see these contusions. So they might be defensive injuries.
And on to the next slide, please. Again, you've done a summary then with respect to just the lower extremities, and again listed quite a few injuries on both the right and left. Is that your accurate summary up there?
I believe it is, and again, there are other injuries that are not being depicted here. There are other injuries on the thighs, on the surfaces of the thighs, on the sides of the thighs, And so there are certainly more contusions and abrasions that I showed you just in those few photographs. What's interesting, again, is that, again, inside of the skin, we will reflect the skin of the legs as well to see if this is real injury, if it's antemortem injury, and in fact, there is hemorrhage around the right leg, the right ankle, and the right foot, so we know that those happened while she was alive.
From viewing them, is some of that, again, could that be from being dragged?
If it was very shortly within that perimortem period, it certainly could be.
Could be from a kick or a punch?
To that area, yes, it's a blunt force injury, yes.
Do you then have some additional photographs?
Yes, the upper extremities, so now we're looking at her wrists and hands. We are looking at Ms. Vanderheyden's left hand, so on her left wrist, we can see contusions and abrasions. The darker areas are the abrasions, again, where it's starting to dry, that skin is starting to dry. The circle is showing you a contusion in that area. On the right side of your screen is a photograph of the back of Ms. Vanderheyden's wrist, and on the left side is the back of her hand. You can see that there are multiple abrasions, again, that drying darker skin, but we can also see the blue is showing the abrasions on the wrist. But we can also see that there are bruises on her knuckles, as depicted by the large blue circle. And if I may advance the slide, there are also bruises on the inside of her hand. So on the bottom of her palm, identified by the yellow circle, on her thumb, identified by the yellow circle. And if I may advance the slide,
Please.
you can see that there's actually a scratch mark, another abrasion, but like a scratch or a scraping that's on the inside of her thumb as well. Advancing the slide forward, we can see the photographs of her nails. Now, because I mentioned that we clip the nails, we take the scraping, instead of taking scrapings from underneath, we'll actually take the distal portions, we'll just clip the nails and submit those if needed. So these are injuries before her hands were washed. So there's some artifact on here, but the part I want to highlight are actually the fingernails and the ends of those fingernails themselves. Specifically, if you look on the index finger, you can see that there's a crack at the tip of the fingernail. There are similar cracks and irregularities on the middle and ring fingers, and also on the thumb. You can see how irregular and kind of scratched that fingernail is. Advancing again, this is the back of Ms. Vanderheyden's right hand, and the circle is now identifying the bruises on the back of her fingers at one of the joints, one of the knuckle joints. The knuckles are actually a little bit higher up on the fist, but these are the backs of her fingers. And advancing the slide forward one more time, again, we're looking at the irregularities of the nails here as well. We can see the index finger on the right. That's the first circle. The second circle is going to identify what that fingernail looks like in profile. And you can see that that fingernail is actually lifted away from the nail. It's actually torn off. You can see that there are irregularities of the next finger, the second finger, the middle finger, and also of the ring finger on that same hand. Again, irregular absences or scratches of the fingernails.
Thank you. And then again, you did a summary with respect to the injuries to the upper extremities as well?
Yes, I forgot to mention the nail on the thumb also has this irregular jagged edge. And this is the injuries of the upper extremities in total, right and left.
So we have some 51 to the right and some 37 aside from the hemorrhages that you note with respect to the upper extremities. Is that correct?
This is the sum total of all of them, yes, including the hemorrhage and the contusions I've already shown you.
You did summarize in your report some 241 separate injuries. 241, is that correct?
Correct.
Would you be able to characterize any of these or be able to distinguish were any of these defensive injuries?
You know, defensive injury is any injury that occurs when a person is trying to either extricate themselves from that environment or to protect themselves. Sometimes they might even engage their attacker. So defensive injuries have a tendency to be in those areas that would come into contact with an individual, such an attacker. So for example, the hands. If somebody had a knife, for example, you might have sharp force injuries or cuts on the hands. If you're trying to fight them off, you might have bruises on your hands. If you're trying to protect yourself, if you're trying to extricate yourself, you could either have scratches on the person or you can have scratches on your surrounding environment. You can also have injuries in unusual places like the feet if you're kicking somebody. But remember that trying to extricate yourself from a scenario is also a defensive injury. So injuries to the back, if somebody curls up into a ball, technically injuries of the back might be defensive injuries as they're trying to protect themselves. So they have to be described in terms of the context and whether they're consistent. On Ms. Vanderheyden, the broken nails are certainly significant. The fact that she has bruises on the palm of her hand, on her thumb, and on the bottom of her feet are also concerning. And the fact that she has injuries on her wrists and on her ankles are also concerning because those are areas where you try to control the limbs. So those are consistent with defensive injuries.
Why the feet?
The feet are generally a protected site. You're standing or you're walking. If you're lying down, that means that, you know, if you have injuries on the feet, that means that the foot pads were exposed, right? Certainly the bottom of your foot. The question is how did you get that? And they're difficult to explain. I mean, I've certainly never seen injuries on the soles of the feet that were associated with a fall, or with running, or with walking in high heels. You just really don't see that. And that's what makes them very important and very significant, is that they are bruises in an unusual part of the body that normally doesn't get exposed.
With respect to the examination, does it also involve lab work with respect to draws and determinations of alcohol in a person's system or controlled substances?
Yes.
Was that done in this case?
Yes, it was.
Was there a blood alcohol concentration determined in this manner?
Yes.
And what was Nicole's blood alcohol?
I believe it is 0.107%, but if I may refer to the report, I can
Thank you if you need
confirm.
to.
Yeah, the blood ethanol concentration was 0.107%.
Thank you. Doctor, you took a number of swabs both at the scene, and then was the swabbing done while the examination was taking place in Madison as well?
Yes.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's been marked Exhibit 21. Are you able to identify what that is?
Yes, this is a diagram that I made of areas of the body that corresponded to swabs that were taken at the time of autopsy.
And there's a great number of areas shaded on that, is that correct?
Well, essentially the whole body.
And this is your work based on what you did with respect to this investigation, is that correct?
Correct.
I'm going to ask that exhibit be entered into evidence, and then if that is allowed, we'd ask to be able to use a larger. Swabbing took place.
Yeah, some of the areas are not projecting very well, either areas of the body where swabs were taken, and that essentially the entire body should be shaded in.
And this particular diagram, this is, am I correct, just the swabs that were done in Madison, not the ones at the scene, or does it also have the ones at the scene?
No, this is just the swabs that were done at the autopsy. I can explain how we do that if you.
Could you just give us a summary of how swabbing is done?
Sure. So the reason it
summary.
essentially involves the entire body is that the swab isn't just one line. For the forehead, for example, which are numbers 81 and 80, and those are not my numbers, those are the numbers that I believe the crime lab gave to them, but the swabs are basically, I would just take a swab and swab the entire forehead and overlap a little bit with the cheeks, and then, excuse me, when I take the cheek swabs, then I overlap a little bit with the cheeks and the chin, then the chin and overlap a little bit with the neck, and so when I'm taking the right arm, the front and back, I'm overlapping a little bit at the elbow with the forearm. So that's why I say that it should essentially all be shaded in. Usually it's one swab, but in larger areas it might be two swabs that are submitted as one just to cover a larger area. And all of those areas, entire front, head, neck, the back of the neck, the entire torso, the abdomen, the chest, the breast separately, the nipples separately, the front portions of the arms, the back portions of the arms, all of those were swabbed.
And if I have not, we also move that exhibit in as well at this time.
21 is received.
Okay, thank you.
Is that 22?
I think that might be
Oh, yeah,
22.
22 is the big board. All
Yes, thank you.
right. For the record, any objection to that, subject to cross, Attorney Schuker?
No, Judge, thank you.
All right. The big board, exhibit 22 is received.
Thank you. Doctor, we talked about the significant injuries to the neck area. We're going to go back to that photo, a couple of photos in that area perhaps.
The brain sparing on the inside. And we see the same thing, if this forwards appropriately, on the other side. Again, the dashed mark, light sparing on the inside of the skin. Those are very consistent with the ligature marks. So as the skin is being compressed by a ligature, you will have no blood in that area or no reaction, but you can have it around the upper portions of the ligature, or if it's moving, you can also have abrasion associated with it, or either the ligature is moving or the person is moving.
So just for clarification, on the right side where you say it's a wider mark, you're indicating there's movement taking place, either the ligature, the cord, or whatever device is being moved, or Nicole is struggling and moving against the cord?
There's movement, and I can't say which one. It could either be the ligature or it could be the decedent moving.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then the next photograph is the back, and again, this just highlights that upside-down V shape, again, the sparing on the back, which is consistent with the ligature, especially if it's being pulled upward and backward as it comes together. It could potentially even be crossed, I don't know that. And then the sum total of the injuries of the neck.
Thank
if I
you.
may. So this is a busy diagram. Basically what I wanted to show you is not all the names of all the muscles, but just the muscles. These are the muscles of the neck. And what we see again on the internal examination is that there's a band of hemorrhage that's going around the neck, and it's a very discrete band of hemorrhage that's going around the neck, and that again is consistent with the ligature. It could also be consistent with a manual strangulation, but I don't have anything to say specifically. I don't have bruises that will be consistent with fingerprints, for example. I know for a fact there was a ligature.
And excuse me, doctor, you said manual strangulation. I take it you mean hands?
Correct, yes, I'm
Thank you.
sorry.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
So advancing forward, so we see that bruising all around the neck of the muscles of the neck. In this diagram also on the circle, you can see there's a portion of the muscle that in the photograph has been moved to the side, so you can see that there's the vasculature, the carotid artery, and the jugular vein. In Ms. Vanderheyden, there's actually contusion of those veins. There's an external sheath around each of those vessels, and you can actually, that was contused as well. So we know that the pressure was significant enough to compress both the carotid artery and the jugular vein. What that means is that she has blood flowing into her head through the vertebral column, but there's no way for it to get out. She's also not getting blood from the heart because the carotids have been collapsed. And what happens as a result of that is that blood starts to pool, it starts to collect, and it causes contusion, or, excuse me, not contusion, like a swelling or a congestion in those areas. One good way of doing it would be potentially to compress your finger and push her trachea, which is her windpipe, the epiglottis, which is that strange little flap in your throat that closes up and down every time. And interestingly, there's a line of sparing too. So again, even inside where that ligature was compressed, there was no blood getting to that area. So you see this nice area of sparing where that ligature was.
And again, that would be indicative of force?
It's indicative of compression of the
Compression.
neck. And as you continue with that congestion, you can get it in various areas. So there will be, the vessels will start to break. They're never meant to hold this much blood. So what they do is they break in tiny little points, and they cause these pinpoint hemorrhages called petechial hemorrhages. So we see that on the epiglottis, that flap, but we also see it in her eyes. And again, this is just a diagram of her eyes, but you can see petechial hemorrhages on the lower eyelids. And she also had rupture of the vessels in the eye. If you've ever seen anybody who has been so bloodshot that the blood actually starts to spread throughout the sclera, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing scleral hemorrhages as well. And that was it, I'm sorry.
Thank you, and appreciate you clarifying that and putting that together to make it more clear for a layperson. So you've indicated there were basically two cause of deaths in this case,
Correct.
and you can't determine, though, which came first.
No, as you can see, there are injuries, internal hemorrhages associated with both. So I know that she was alive at the time both happened. Could both have happened at the same time? Yes, and therefore they're both included.
Thank you. Now, going back to the injuries to her genitalia area, the variety and the different ones that were located, was that suggestive of anything to you?
Well, obviously blunt force injuries to any genitalia or sexual organ, one must consider the possibility of a sexual assault. And so the fact that there are injuries inside the vaginal vault as well as on the outside includes that as a possibility.
Did you also determine manner of death in this matter?
I did.
And what was that?
The manner is homicide.
With respect to your opinions on the possibility of a sexual assault, the causes of death, the manner of death, do you hold all of these opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
I do.
And those are your opinions today, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. State has no further questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's begin our cross-examination.
Thank you, Doctor. You testified earlier that some of these injuries could be classified or categorized as a defensive type injury.
That's correct?
And the injuries to the nails, would that qualify as a defensive type injury?
It could, yeah, it'd certainly be an injury that one could see in defense.
And any evidence that would have come from the fingernails or fingernail clippings or under the fingernails, those were collected as evidence?
Correct? We clip the fingernails and submit them for evidence.
And then specifically on the victim's left hand, did she have injuries to her nails on that hand?
Yes, she did. She had injuries to nails on both hands.
Can you explain the injuries to the nails on her left hand?
Yeah, she had, either, would you prefer I use the PowerPoint or the report to give you the exact fingernails?
Just the report, please.
Thank you.
I believe it's page 9 on your report.
Thank you. Okay. Broken left index finger, jagged and splintered ends of the left thumb, the middle, and the ring fingers.
And just again, so any of the nail clippings from that left hand would have been collected and then given to, I believe, Sergeant Lopnow?
Correct.
Now, all of your testimony today, it's all based on observations you made when you conducted the autopsy, and then you combine that with your experiences as a forensic pathologist in your education, correct?
Correct.
So essentially, you see an injury, you identify it, and then you use your training, experience, and education, and you help explain it in court for the jury, correct?
Correct, in addition to using literature if needed.
Sure. Could we call your testimony or broadly define it as medical testimony?
It's medical legal testimony. I am a forensic pathologist. I am a doctor. I'm not sure what you mean by medical testimony as opposed to forensic pathologist.
Would you agree that medicine and law are two distinct areas of specialty? For example, you're a forensic pathologist and we're lawyers. That's two different areas of specialty.
Those are two different areas of specialty, but I have specific training in the investigation and identification of injury and trauma that goes beyond just basic medical training, and so that's why it's called medical legal death investigation, because it does bridge the gap between the two.
Can you give us the medical definition of sexual assault?
I think that it has broad connotations. I'm not sure if there's a single source that you're using for sexual assault. I would imagine that it would depend on what source you're using, what book. When I say sexual assault, I'm saying that there's an injury to a sexual organ that is not explained by natural disease.
And that would be the medical definition?
I'm not sure that would be my definition.
And you testified that some of these injuries are suggestive of sexual assault?
Yes, again, these are injuries to sexual organs. So it's an assault or an injury to an organ that is a sexual organ, the breasts and the genitalia.
Do reasonable alternatives exist to this being a sex assault?
Yes.
Could consensual sex be an alternative?
Yes, it could.
So I just want to lay out this hypothetical using the facts of this case. The victim could have been having consensual sex with one person that caused the injuries to the victim's genitalia, but was then beaten by somebody different after the consensual sex. That is a reasonable alternative, correct?
Correct.
And then that example would not be defined as sexual assault, correct?
Having sex with somebody and incurring injuries from that, if it's consensual, would not necessarily make an assault, but it would still have injuries. Here, we have injuries to, the injuries that are consistent with sexual contact are the penetration injuries, the ones in the vagina, and then there are other injuries, which are the abrasions and the contusions on the mons pubis, and the patterns of those are not consistent with a sexual, simple sexual intercourse, for example, in the missionary position. Does that explain the two?
Yes. Are there any other reasonable alternatives that exist to this being a sex assault?
There are all sorts of explanations. The point of the medical examiner is to document the injuries and to determine the cause and the manner of death. I cannot possibly define for you the tens to hundreds of different scenarios because these are blunt trauma injuries. They could be caused by different objects, different people, different time frames. So it would be unfair for me to say, either for you or for the prosecution or anybody else, that this is exactly what happened. But I can tell you that it's consistent with something. So if there's a scenario you'd like to ask me about, I can tell you whether it's consistent or not.
And again, it could be consistent with consensual sex.
The penetration injuries of the vagina could be consistent with consensual sex.
And then just one other area, doctor. Some of the injuries that you identified and observed, they have a repeating pattern, which could suggest a non-natural object.
They could, yes.
And one of the injuries that repeats has a zigzag pattern, like an M, an N, or a V type letter.
Yes, correct.
And another pattern of injuries has a D or U-shaped type letter.
The groupings, yeah, sometimes when they're grouped together, some of those contusions fall into either a U shape or a D shape on the body.
And then there's another pattern that existed that was a semicircular abrasion.
There are multiple semicircular abrasions. If there's a specific one, we can discuss it.
Could those semicircular abrasions be consistent with fingernails?
I'm sorry, with what?
Fingernails?
Well, some of them could be, again, there are lots of those injuries on the body. If there's a specific one you'd like to talk to, because semicircular just means that it's in the shape of a circle or a half circle. So even the injuries on the back that we saw, those had they were kind of like a circle. They were semicircular, but those are caused not by fingernails, but those are caused by a scraping motion. So broadly, I can't say that, but if you have a specific one or individual ones, we can talk about that.
I don't. General is fine. Thank you. When you testified or when I asked the question which could suggest a non-natural object, what do you mean by non-natural object?
Could you repeat what the reference of the question was?
So some of the injuries have repeating type patterns which suggest a non-natural object.
Oh, so you're specifically talking about that have the geometric shapes?
Yes.
So there are some injuries on the body which we haven't shown you that have geometric shapes. So geometric shapes are found in some pieces of nature. They could be natural. So for example, a honeycomb is a natural object and has a very repeating pattern, a hexagonal pattern. But for the most part, the natural world prefers randomness. So for example, we saw her in that field with a lot of grass. We would expect swooshing, semicircular scrapes or abrasions. But when you start seeing things that are square, hexagonal, that have mathematical or geometric patterns, one has to consider the possibility that the object had that shape, and that's why those injuries have that shape as well. So it's known as a pattern injury. And some of these are suggestive of a pattern. They have groupings and they have repeating patterns, which is suggestive that this was the shape of the object. Therefore, it's not part of her natural body. It's not a natural disease. It's not something that was incurred by her or her natural disease or the state of her body.
Just one last question about the external object, doctor. Like you did with, I believe it was Exhibit 23, you can try to actually identify the object used to cause those different injuries, but you actually need an object to compare them to, correct?
I can identify the patterns, and it's my job actually to identify the pattern as accurately as possible, the shape, the size, but it's outside of the scope of my expertise to say it was absolutely caused by that, or to say, sometimes we can, for example, say this is suggestive of a ball-peen hammer because it leaves a specific mark, or this is suggestive of a double-edged blade because it leaves a specific injury finding. But ultimately, that's just one piece of the puzzle. What I can say is whether it's consistent or not consistent with something that is presented to me.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Judge.
All right, thank you. Any redirect?
Thank you, Doctor. So you indicated that on your direct testimony, you testified that the numerous injuries to the genitalia were suggestive of a sexual assault. Is that correct?
I did.
On cross, you were asked, could the penetration injuries caused by penetration, forceful penetration to the vaginal area, that could also be the result of consensual sex, is that correct?
Correct?
That's a possibility, is that your testimony?
Yes?
But in viewing where those injuries took place, just specifically dealing with the penetration areas, that would still be painful even if it were consensual, is that correct?
Yes.
And when you made your determination that after your examination, your viewing of the location and the number of injuries, did that also factor into your determination that these injuries to the genitalia were indicative of a sexual assault?
Yeah, obviously my opinions are made in the whole of what I have, and so certainly I wouldn't be able to exclude consensual sex, but when you have injuries of the genitalia, especially in context of other injuries to the body, the head, the neck, some of which are fatal, one has to consider the possibility that it was a sexual assault as well.
When you spoke of being asked if other items would be consistent with drawing patterns, are there other experts that deal in that area with respect to not only is something consistent, but this object did make that pattern?
Yes, there are. And this is not to say that if somebody asked me to compare an object, I wouldn't be able to say it's consistent or not. It's just that it would be inappropriate for me to look at something and say, aha, this was done by, a screwdriver number 14 with a yellow handle. There's only so much that the autopsy can tell you, and yet one has to know the limitations. And so I can describe the injuries, I describe the patterns, and then potentially if asked by the defense, by the prosecution or anybody, whether it's consistent with that, then I can say yes or no. But I cannot say that it was X object that did it.
I have nothing further, thank you.
Any recross?
Yes, Judge, thank you. I just want to refer back to that original hypothetical and try to clarify. So, doctor, again, this is a hypothetical. If the victim was having consensual sex with another person, and let's say that person was male, and they're roughly a larger male, and then in the middle of that, if another male, for however he did it, incapacitated that first male, and then abused the victim and created all these types of injuries that you went over, all these blunt force trauma injuries, could that still explain your findings?
So I think there's like 4 or 5 different questions there.
It's
Could
one
you
just
break
very-
them down?
Just one very big hypothetical. Could that be consistent with your findings today?
So
I'm going to object to the manner of the question she's indicated. If she could reformat the question.
Well, why don't we try, I'll sustain just on the form of the question. You want to just try it, rephrase it and see if it flows a little better.
Sure. So I'll just go piece by piece in my hypothetical, doctor. So let's assume that the victim was having consensual sex with one male, one individual that's much larger. Some of the injuries to the genitalia could be explained by consensual sex, just framing it at that moment, correct?
the injuries inside the vaginal vault are consistent with penetration. I cannot say whether they were the result of consensual sex or violent sex. They're just consistent with a vaginal penetration, yes.
And then if that person, if that male, that larger male, was then for whatever reason incapacitated in some way, and then you have a second male come into the picture and start to beat the victim and cause all of these injuries with his fists, with his feet, other maybe external weapons, could that then explain the forceful trauma that you saw to the other regions?
So I think that is outside my area of expertise. It would actually expect me to be clairvoyant. What I have is, I can't tell you who did it, right? The autopsy report documents the injuries, right?
Judge, if I could just
wasn't
object
there.
a second, that's why this was a hypothetical, and that's why we're trying to just get, and I'm not trying to ask that you be clairvoyant, I'm just asking for the hypothetical, if that could explain it.
I'd ask,
Well, why don't you let her finish her answer first, okay, Doc? And then you can follow up. Go ahead and finish your answer.
Sure. So I can tell you what injuries occurred, but as we talked about with the head injury and the ligature, I can't tell you what order they occurred in. I also can't tell you what order they occurred in, but with the penetration. Could this be a perimortem injury? Could it be an antemortem injury? Yes. Could it have occurred shortly after death or just before death after these other injuries were incurred? Yes. So I cannot distinguish the time frame in which these happen, and therefore I cannot distinguish how many times she had sex that evening or that day or in that 24-hour period. What I can tell you is that there are injuries at the inferior portion of the vaginal vault that could be either as a result, they are the result of penetration. They could be the result of forceful or consensual sex. Then I also have additional injuries on the outside of the genitalia, on the mons pubis and on the labia, that go all the way deep into the fat of that tissue, and then also into the muscle of that tissue. So they're much deeper injuries. Who caused them, in what order, and when? There's nothing specific in this particular autopsy that would allow me to answer that question, because that's not the scope of the examination. And it never would be.
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay?
I'm just going to ask, can you tell if it was one person or more than one person then that would have inflicted those injuries?
The autopsy would not tell me that. There's no way to know.
All right. Do you have any redirect, Ms. Attorney Kerrigan-Maris?
No, thank you very much.
Any recross, Attorney Schuchert?
No, thank you.
All right, Doctor, thank you very much. You're excused.
Thank you.
Step down.
Thank you. Who should I give the exhibits to?
Thank you, Doctor. Safe travels.
Thank you very much. Thank you for accommodating me.
You bet.
You are excused. Thank you very much.
The witness is excused, and it's about 10 to 12. This is probably a good stopping point for our lunch break. Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we reconvene and get started about 1:15? We'll take our lunch break at this time, and we'll continue with the state's case and their next witness at 1:15 this afternoon. All right? Have a good lunch.